it began, I'm trying to remember, I think it was in my junior year of college. So I was studying computer science at Michigan Technological University up in the Keweenaw Peninsula, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I, I was, nearing the end of like taking all my computer science courses. I had a lot of like other non-computer science courses to complete before graduating. But yeah, so at the time, I was religious and I'd grown up religious. And so I went to church and they had a program there called Awana. Basically, it's for kids. They would like memorize Bible verses. And yeah, I was, it's not something I am into anymore. And I'll talk more about that, later on here. But at the time I was into it. And so I helped out with that program, at the church. And, yeah, so it wasn't really all that complicated. Like in this case, every Wednesday, a bunch of kids would come to the church and, they had to do a lot of like bookkeeping for the kids, like checking them into the program, writing down who is allowed to pick them up and, having a parent sign them out at the end. And they also tracked like their progress throughout this program and how many points they had and their attendance and just a bunch of random bookkeeping stuff. And so I got involved, just sort of volunteering. And, it's one of those obvious situations where they used a spreadsheet and, like, it worked, but it seemed really cumbersome to me. And especially someone who I wasn't like new to programming per se. Like I had even at this point already been working a programming job. I don't technically know what title I had or what it was considered at the time, but for a few years, for a company, on top of doing all my own programming and for a long time before that. And I had released other programs as open source and, had users and, open source libraries. And so I wasn't like new to programming, but I was still like, really excited for the potential possibilities of programming, right? So it was like everything I saw was like, oh, I can do that better, I saw these spreadsheets, right? And I was like, yeah, I can make something that's a lot better than that, and like I saw the person, doing it would have to like copy and paste a bunch of stuff and, run this, they sort of ran some equations on the spreadsheet and then they had to like match up records with, parents' names and print all this, sort of make this copy paste something into Word. And you know how it goes, right? In these situations, lots of manual labor and work. And there were, errors that would, come in. And then, so later I was asking this person like, oh, how do you like actually get like the kids like points and attendance? How are you putting this in this other spreadsheet? And they're like, oh yeah, it takes me like 6 hours every week. And another one of those spreadsheet situations where they're copying data back and forth, blah, blah, blah. And so, of course, I'm like, oh, I can do better. So I just started writing a replacement for these spreadsheets and stuff. I don't know if I really started with grander ambitions at this point, although I had always been looking for some sort of, company or, I wanted to make a web application and sell it. I wasn't really why I was doing this originally. I really just wanted to make this for this person to save them time, and to just improve accuracy. And I thought it'd be fun, right? So, the classic journey, right? So I started building it and, I built the first version in Lisp in Chicken Scheme, which is, just a version of Scheme, which is a dialect of Lisp. And it was really basic. I don't think I've even put this in source control right away. So I can't even, like, the initial commit is pretty, far along compared to this. But if I remember right, it was super simple. Like I think it had a web interface. I started with a web interface. I don't think there was any JavaScript. It was all just like forms that would get submitted. Um, and maybe the most interesting part was I just started with using files essentially as the database. So if you're not familiar with Lisp, one like basically the reason why I like it so much and why most people like it so much is the code and the data are basically the same thing. So I would say it would be most similar to if JSON was JavaScript. Like if you could serialize all of your code as data and use your, data and code and like mix them together as one thing and serialize it. And, that would be, what Lisp is in a sense. I mean, it's a lot more than that, but in the case I'm talking about here with, storing data, I took advantage of this property of Lisp where you can just take some Lisp code/data and call the write method and just write it to a file. And then when your program starts up, you can just read it from a file. So it'd be like JSON, except it's a lot more powerful because it can do way more than JSON, right? But it's also super simple. Just read and write, just one call. And you can, so like basically you could take a data structure that you have in memory and just say write, and it writes your data structure to memory, and it's in plain text. You could just edit it in a text editor, but then you can also read it back into memory in your program, just like, your program never stopped running, right? So yeah, the way this started was super simple. My data store was, I think I started with just one file and just wrote the contents of my program to it essentially. And then when the program, if I ever restarted the web server, it would read that file up again and I'd be right where I left off. It worked fine for a prototype. In fact, I think it was a great solution. I didn't have to spend any time setting up a database or anything. Like I just wrote like I was writing a program that didn't need a database, just that stored everything in memory, right? And so it was super fast to iterate on. And so every week I would come in and show this person like, hey, look what I did. Like it does this now and this now. And they would be like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Can you like make it do this too? That would actually, we might be able to actually use this, And so I think this went on for a few months. And I just made it for me and this person, basically. I would add whatever features we felt it needed and I could do. And iterated on it extremely quickly. So yeah, I think I at this point I hadn't really, it still wasn't technically launched or anything. But pretty early on, we started actually using it. I think the first thing we used it for was to keep track of the kids and the parent or guardian that was allowed to pick them up, and then automatically creating a PDF that could be printed out that the parent or guardian could sign when they picked up the kids, right? And so I would sit there with I had like a little Asus EEE laptop that I got on, I got it on Woot back in the day. I think I got it for like $150 or $175. It came with Linux on it. It was amazing. It was tiny, but it was my sole computer for like 5 years. So I did all my work on this little tiny thing, right? And I would sit there at the church and the kids would come in and, I would look them up on this system and check a box that they were in attendance. And then, when it came time for the kids to leave, I'd just click a button and it would pop up a PDF that had just the kids that were there that day and who was allowed to pick them up. And then next to him was, a line to have a parent or guardian sign it, right? Super simple. And that's how it started. That was all the features it had. That was really it. It was just this thing, that let you check your kids out essentially. But of course, I kept working on it, kept iterating on it. I kept adding more features. And this is when I really was like starting to get the idea of like, this is like, so I added some other features that we did start using, right? And this is when I started to get the idea of maybe it's useful to other Awana programs and other churches and, other systems like this, right? So I kept adding features, like keeping track of attendance, and they had these different like point scoring systems, and I added a bunch of features like this, and we actually were using them at this church. In fact, I completely replaced all of the spreadsheets and everything that they were doing manually with this program that was tailor made for this church and what they were doing. But at this point, I was like, this actually could be useful. And I found like some forums online, and I started, just sort of looking around, and, there were some existing programs that did this, but they looked like they were written in like the 90s, and they weren't web enabled. They were all like desktop applications that you just ran on one computer. And I thought they had a lot of limitations. And of course I was like, yeah, I can do this better, right? Like, I can do better than this, right? I could do better than these. And so I was like, there's definitely a demand for it. And like, I could see people were using these programs. And so then I was like, all right, I'm going to really do this. And so I did more research on like how other churches do it and other programs do it and how it compares to this one. And so I started making my program more generic, but then this is where we get into some really funny stuff.